Hello everyone, this is Great Value Wes Huff. We're going to be talking again about Ammon Hillman, and particularly in the discussion that Wes Huff had on a recent podcast, the Julian Dury podcast. I don't even know how to pronounce that. But he basically talked about an argument that Ammon's made. We're basically going to be talking about what the Christ in Jesus Christ means. And Ammon's made some pretty wild claims. Uh, Ahmed's made some pretty wild claims, and West has taken him to task. So we're going to talk about that today and see what kind of arguments Wes has in store for us.
Named Ammon Hillman. This is a guy who, to empathize with him, has been attacked mercilessly for years by structures up to and including the literal Catholic Church, where, they got him kicked out of jobs and shit like.
Uh, Apparently, Julian has not read the court documents, which you can actually read on my YouTube video that we'll see in the comments. So there's this false impression that Amin got kicked out of the school he was teaching because of free speech and of a play. But no, it was sexual misconduct, and you can read it. Like, I literally read the court documents if you want to check it out.
That.
Right.
And at the base case, as someone on an expert of languages, there's no doubt that he has a massive understanding. It doesn't mean he's right about everything, but he has a massive understanding of ancient languages and certain parts of that very few, if any, people study. There are guys like Brian Morescu who talk about and have cited him before and talk about what a brilliant guy he is. That said, the reason I wasn't the biggest fan is because I think, in the equal but opposite reaction to life that I talked about earlier, he has been strongly behaviorally motivated by anger at what has been, I agree, unfairly done to him in many ways, that has kind of pushed him to a point where he wants to get to the opposite conclusion no matter what. So it's not good enough that, like, for example, the Catholic Church and the teachings of Christianity are wrong. It's like, no, Jesus used kids as drugs, and it has to go too far. That said,
I do find it really interesting that Amin goes on these big spiels about, like, hey, you shouldn't do scholarship if you are, motivated by other things other than truth. But it seems really interesting that Amin seems to be motivated by things other than truth. Now, some might say, oh, well, he's not motivated by money, as if that's the only thing that you could be motivated by. Like, what about power or control or feeling like you're helping people? There could be a lot of different reasons. Not necessarily bad things that you could be reason to be motivated about, but the main thing that we have to keep in mind here is making sure we're being motivated by truth, not all these other things.
I listened to that podcast back when it came out. I haven't listened to it since. So there were a lot of things in there. I'm a little hazy on some of the stuff. I know you've gone through that and whatever, but what were some of the biggest points of contention that you felt you had evidence against that he made from, let's say, like a translation basis in there?
Yeah, that's a good kind of segue within this conversation because Ammon does have a very specific level of expertise and he's very proficient in classical Greek as it relates to medical texts. Now, classicalism in terms of ancient Greek literature is huge. I mean, there's a wide spectrum of all sorts of things that fall into classics. Everything from like Plato and Xenophon to these medical texts that individuals like Ammon are dealing with. I think part of the problem, and aside from the character assassination that I can't speak to because I've only seen bits and parts of it and would probably agree with you that that's not fair. His arguments in particular are not just fringe, they're him against the entirety of the scholarship. And that's where he's taking very specific parameters for words and he's then applying them in ways in contexts where they just do not apply. And
so the reason why Wes mentions that he is not only fringe, but him against all of scholarship is because not like, oh, all the scholars agree, therefore he must be wrong. Like, no, nobody's ever going to make that argument. Like, that's a nonsense argument, okay? So if you think that's what someone says by that, you need to rethink how you're listening to them, okay? So the reason why people say everybody in scholarship disagrees, because just on face value, the chances of literally all scholars disagreeing with someone is just astronomically low if you have a good argument. Doesn't mean that someone's wrong based off that. What it means is that we need to be really, 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 really careful with someone that has literally all of the experts in the world disagreeing with them. And just to get to a little bit more detail, why is that so astronomically low? Okay. For one, there are scholars on all ends of the spectrum. You have very conservative scholars that only want to justify the Bible. Then you have very, very, very liberal scholars, just very, very, very liberal, that any chance they will get, they will willingly accept views that are just absolutely wild and crazy. Why that is important is because if someone like Ammon comes to a scholar like that, that is predisposed to be looking for views that, go with whatever they want to believe before that. Someone like that is going to go with views that are just absolutely wild and crazy to everybody else, but because they want to justify whatever they already believe about, Jesus or Christianity in general, they're willing to believe in negative things. So the very fact that Ammon has managed to convince nobody in scholarship about his interpretation is just wild. It is insane. Surely, if he has good evidence for his arguments, someone out there would believe him. There are literally hundreds of people looking for reasons to basically critique the Bible. They're looking for reasons to dismiss it. Like, that is very obvious to anybody who's familiar with scholarship. All the time, there are new views that are proposed that get submitted in peer review, that scholars like to talk about, that are that portray the Bible in negative ways. Think about the topic of the Trinity. Lots of scholars say that the biblical writers were not Trinitarian. Think about Asherah and El in the Old Testament. Think about the documentary hypothesis. How so many scholars would say, hey, most of the Old Testament is not historical. Or the New Testament, where a lot of the New Testament writers don't think the text is historical. You even have Carl Ruck, who doesn't even believe Jesus existed at all, who is very familiar with Ammon's views. He doesn't even think Ammon's right about a lot of the stuff he says. You don't think someone like Carl Ruck would be wanting to accept Ammon's views that portray Jesus in such a negative light? Ammon has managed to convince literally zero scholars out there. And if there is a scholar, bring him up. Point him out in the comments.
And individuals who I greatly disagree on a whole range of things. Individuals like Dan McClellan and Kip Davis, who Kip is actually a fellow Canadian. He lives out in British Columbia, but have pointed out the fact that what he's doing is he's applying a very specific level of terminology within the ancient Greek language in cases where it doesn't apply. And so it's the equivalent of saying, so in my own sort of sphere and field, there are specific terminologies that exist within theology, like we talk about Christ condescending. And what we mean by that is literally the Latin con, meaning with, and descend, to come down. And so when we're talking about the condescension of Christ, what we're talking about is the humility of Christ to step out of his eternal throne as the second person of the Trinity, stepping into humanity. But if you were to say to someone after this, if someone said like, hey, you met Wes Huff, how was he? And you went, he's a little bit condescending. You wouldn't be talking about my humility.
No.
Right? Because that word has a different meaning in its different context. And part of the problem with something like what Ammon says is that he's taking terminology that exists within the parameters of a specific field, and then he's applying them in areas where there's an entirely different contextual meaning and spectrum of understanding. So part of what he said that some people jumped on was that he says that the word Christ comes from the Greek word chrio, which
Yes.
it does, right? To anoint. And in ancient Greek medical texts, there is a usage of that which he has capitalized on with applying drugs to your eyes. Now, more broadly, Rio does mean to rub, particularly a liquid ointment or substance, on your body. So this relates to everything from bathing to ritual practices in religious circumstances. But you could likewise say if you were an ancient Roman and you had a bath and you came out and you put on skin cream,
Right.
so your skin didn't dry out, that was an example of Rio. You were applying it to your body. Well, within the religious connotation of Christianity, it is the translation of the Greek word Mashiach, Messiah, which likewise means anointed one, right? There were multiple anointed ones in the Old Testament. It was just a word that was referred to priests or kings and had a very specific connotation in the Mashiach who would come and be different. And the Greek translation of that, which both the Greek translation of the Old Testament and in the New Testament both use, is Christ. Why? Because it means anointed one. So Ammon takes that and he says, well, in this very specific instance, in this stream of classical medical literature, it means to apply a drug to your eyes. And it does mean that in the particular instance that it's being used. But this is where semantic range is very important. And this is the problem that some others have.
Yeah, should we pull up this clip, by the way?
Sure.
Just so there are people to follow along with.
Right?
Christ. What is the Antichrist?
What is the Christ, if you have to know them? Antichrist, you
Okay, first, that's nonsense. You don't have to know what the anti is something is to know the actual thing. You don't need to know what anti-gravity is to know what gravity is, right? So whatever I'm saying here to start off is just weird and odd why he would ever say that.
have to know the Christ.
Right.
It's a Greek word
For?
for applying a drug to your eyes so that they may be open.
That's what the Christ means in Greek.
Yes, it's from the verb chrio, to be stung by the gadfly. Who's the gadfly? It's a state of mania. They call it in Greek oistromania, to be in an altered state.
Right.
It's a thing they had going on. Remember, they have orgies and stuff like that, so you better buckle up.
Okay.
So that and that's kind of what you were just getting at with what he says there. But you're saying that like he's stretching some of his knowledge on the pharmacological history of language and bringing that into, say, Jesus's lexicon and how he says things.
He's confusing and conflating whole realms of how we do interpretation of ancient languages and how those operate within a specific context. So in the biblical documents, Christ has a very specific meaning and application. That doesn't mean that Rio does not mean applying a drug to your eyes that you may see.
Right. So the word can mean what Ammon wants it to be in some instances, but it doesn't mean in absolutely every instance that's what the word means. And it certainly doesn't mean that in the biblical text. And an obvious way to know that is you can just look at how the word is used in other contexts and how the actual context of how it is used is actually contradicting what Ammon is saying.
That's not what anybody is saying. I don't think anybody who reads classical Greek would say that that's not true. It's just that that's what it means in a very specific instance, right? I could talk about the right to bear arms, and I could be talking about firearms, or I could be talking about a grizzly bear, right? That Ammon has a lot of proficiency in classical Greek.
I can think of a number of people who would disagree with that.
Yes.
But he doesn't appear to have as much of a proficiency in Koine Greek.
That's the slippery slope with a guy like him too, because I will tell you, I don't care what the topic is. Whenever I hear someone come out and say, I'm the only guy that knows
That's pretty good.
about what's happening with this language because
Yeah.
I've been studying this my whole life.
Right.
And there's really no one else who's gone to Israel and studied the Greek among the architecture there.
Yeah.
When I hear that, that says to me like he's therefore saying, because I'm the only knowledge on this, you have to listen to me. And he's precluding that there could be any defenses against what he's saying because other people don't know, which, you know, it's a strong word to use, but when I hear stuff like that, I go, oh, is that like charlatanism? You know, because you're trying to say like, you got to come through me. There's no other bridge here to
Right.
this knowledge.
Yeah, there is a logical fallacy. That's the logical fallacy of the populace in saying that the majority is always right. And I think it's not true that the majority is always right. I mean, I hold positions that is not the position of the majority, even within my field. But it's a matter of then do you have good evidence to push back against the consensus? Because I'm fine with people holding fringe views. I hold a bunch of fringe views. The fact that I date the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke as early as I do is not the consensus within my field. However, I think there are good reasons to do that. And unfortunately, there are positions within Ammon to give him the credit where it's due in saying he knows classical Greek and in a particular vein incredibly well. However, he then extrapolates that and says, this expertise allows me to make conclusions like the Greek translation of the Old Testament is not a translation, it's the original. And the Hebrew is the translation. When of the tens of thousands of Septuagintal scholars, so that's the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, no one holds that position.
Right.
Not like there's a contingent here. Nobody. And I think, unfortunately, it's emblematic of the fact that specificity and expertise in one area does not necessarily then extrapolate it into all of the areas that could possibly be adjacent to
That's
that.
a good point.
So what he's basically saying is that if you want to say that, hey, this word means this, then what you should do is give evidence for your position. Give arguments for why people should think that. As we've noted a number of times on the channel, what Ammon will do is he will take one word from the medical texts in classical Greek. He'll look at a biblical text and say, that is seen over here, so it must be this over there. And then he'll say, I'm a Greek expert, so you should just listen to me. But what he'll never do is he'll never give actual arguments for why you should accept that. He'll never give arguments from the context. He'll never give reasons to justify discounting all the other possible meanings. It's just, hey, this is possible, therefore that's it. I saw this from a text way over there, so that's it. And if you disagree with me, give me an argument for why Wes is wrong here. Wes doesn't need to go and cite a bunch of other texts because it should be pretty obvious that the context that we see in the Gospels is very, very, very different than the context we see in the medical texts. And what we have here is a very interesting explanation for the difference between Koine and classical Greek and how we know about them. Because they are very, very different. But then Ammon wants to say, hey, no, the classical Greek, that should be used to interpret the Koine Greek. But they're different types of Greek. And of course, Ammon is not an expert in this Koine Greek. He's an expert in this one version of classical Greek, in this one specific context. So once again, we need an argument for why we should use this very specific type of language of classical Greek, use definitions from that we don't see in the Koine Greek. We should apply it to the Koine Greek. So what is the argument that goes against all the other arguments given by scholars? What is the argument that means that we definitely must take it that way? What is the argument that goes against all the other evidence? It should be really strong. It should be really, really strong. Where is it? Post in the comments. I know people are going to be like, oh, yeah, Wes and Ammon should debate. And I realize that, hey, Ammon made a bit of a response to this video. I also know that Ammon actually asked Wes to debate. So good on Ammon for doing that. But at the same time, uh, Wes said that he was too busy, at least according to Ammon. And I noticed in people in the comments saying, "Hey, he's scared," or "He just doesn't want to debate because he knows he's going to be wrong," which is a bit unjustified in my opinion. And the obvious reason should be that, hey, nobody has an obligation to debate someone. Wes has a lot of stuff going on. He just had all this stuff with Billy Carson. So why would he take a bunch of time, which would be required, a lot of time? Like, it takes a lot of time to understand Ammon's arguments because they're just not seen in scholarship. Like, they don't exist in scholarship. Um, what reason that would be is up to you to understand, but they don't exist in scholarship. No one's ever heard them before. Obviously, you want to take the time to get it right. So not only would he have to prepare for just to understand Ammon's arguments, he would also have to form rebuttals in a clear, able to understand way. Then, of course, he would have to take the time to debate Ammon. Wes has a lot of stuff going on. He's in school. He's got all of this other stuff going on with YouTube and drama. He's got his own YouTube channel to do content for. Like, that kind of person's got a very limited amount of time. So to act like, hey, you know, Wes is just obligated to debate Ammon, or he must obviously not be right about his opinion is just silly, simply silly. Yeah, should they debate? I don't know. It depends on Wes's schedule. What is important to him? But what you don't hear Ammon mentioning is all the other times he's rejected debates, or when he does interact with scholars, how poorly he treats them. So, yeah, if I'm Wes, I would actually be a little hesitant about a debate like that, just from past conversations that Ammon has had with people. But either way, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you think you got a lot out of this. Make sure you be careful with arguments like this. You got to make sure you really know your stuff before you accept something like something that Ammon said here. But either way, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you check out other videos on the channel, and I hope you have a good one.